Now, Sargon of Akkad in his video, I think that he commits certain mistakes. He's faced with a black woman who denies, who affirms the existence of white privilege. And he links this statement to identity politics. He says, see, that's the ideology of identity politics. But I'd like to point out that I don't know if you agree, Greg, that identity politics is not necessarily linked to a conception of privilege. It's a theoretical political idea in terms of how we want to group ourselves, in terms of how we want to establish society. But the question of privilege is a factual one, and you could think of an identity politics without privilege being a state of fact in your society. Would you agree with this?
Yeah, they're two distinct things, and they don't necessarily need to be linked to one another.
All right. And Sargon of Akkad, so he looks at the exchange and he mentions that it's not a good idea to have student unions for white people. And I was wondering, what's your take on this? Because she says it's good for students' association for black people to exist. And then she gets catched by the interviewer. The interviewer responds, oh, well, what about white associations? And she has to answer, of course, yes, white can have their student associations too. And Sargon vehemently disagrees. Do you think it's a good thing in our society to have white student association and more generally white identity politics?
Yes, I think white identity politics is a good thing. I would make 3 claims about white identity politics. I did a talk about this past weekend, and I also did a hangout with Luke Ford about this last week, but it bears repeating until everybody agrees with me on this matter. I'm just going to keep repeating myself. White identity politics is inevitable, first of all. I would also claim that it's necessary, and I think it's completely moral. There's nothing immoral about white identity politics. Now, why does Sargon think that white identity politics is a bad thing?
You are asking the question. Now, I'm a specialist of Sargon, and I have to say, he doesn't lay out much argument. I've listened pretty much to everything Sargon has produced. And it's actually hard to grasp essentially what's his point. However, there are points that he will come back to very often. So one thing that he will claim is identity politics. And I want to go back to your 3 points because I think they're worth repeating for our audience, and I'd like you to take us through. But let's see the argument of Sargon first. So Sargon says identity politics is inevitably linked to a feeling of persecution from other groups. What would you answer to that? Oh, you are muted.
Yeah, I'm thinking. No, white identity politics or identity politics in general is indeed, I think, linked to persecution from other groups, or at least the potential of persecution from other groups. But I don't think there's anything wrong with acknowledging that fact. There's a kind of meme that floats around right of center circles, especially in the white world, which basically says, oh, it's never good to admit weakness or defeat or vulnerability. And my answer to that is, well, this is politics, not picking up girls. And we need to be real about certain situations. So, yes, indeed, white people are targeted by organized non-white identity politics in every society that's now multicultural. As soon as distinct groups enter white societies, they will organize and collectivize and work in the political realm to take care of their group interests. And unless white people do the same, basically what we're doing is we're making ourselves victims. We're opening ourselves up to being victims of organized group identity politics. And the only way to stop being victims of non-white identity politics is to adopt white identity politics. So The claim that white identity politics is inevitable is very, very simple. You don't need to know anything about morality or biology or history or anything like that. It's simply the common sense recognition that if a group of people feels like they are being targeted, they will eventually resist. They will fight back. And white nationalism is that resistance. We are fighting back against white dispossession. And the idea that it's necessary is specifically this. I believe that it's necessary for white identity politics to become explicit white identity politics, because there's a whole lot of what we can call implicit white identity politics, political ideologies that really only make sense to white people and are expressions of white people's particular nature. And yet at the same time, the people who put these ideas forward are not aware of that fact, or they won't own up to that fact. And implicit white identity politics includes libertarianism and classical liberalism and conservatism. I certainly think the Green Party is a kind of implicit white identity politics, even though it's on the far left generally. And these ideologies are openly, explicitly universalist. Anybody can be a classical liberal. Anybody can be a green. But when you look at the actual parties and what they stand for, and you look at who shows up to these things, you find that really the people who are most comfortable with it and the most committed to these ideologies happen to be white people. And so these are implicit white identity politics. Sargon is a participant and an advocate of implicit white identity politics. So why do we need to make white identity politics explicit? Well, it's very, very simple. If you don't make your white identity politics explicit, you are at a systematic disadvantage in the political realm. And the way that I argue this point is to use an analogy of a card game. In a multicultural society, every group in that society can be likened to a player at a poker game. And every group has its stack of chips, which represents its collective wealth in that society. Now, whites in white societies have the biggest stack of chips, but they don't get to play the race card. Everybody else at the table has a wild card that they can play to fill out their hand, and that is the race card, the group card. But people like Sargon say it would be dirty and wrong for white people to have a race card, for white people to explicitly appeal to white identity, to basically say in a political argument that the argument stops with a statement like, this is who we are, this is who I am, and you don't have to justify yourself any further. That's ultimately what identity politics means. It means that there are absolute, final, non-negotiable, but legitimate appeals to simply saying, this is who I am. This is what I'm comfortable with. Sue me, fight me, whatever. I'm not budging. And if white people play by the rules that are being put forward by Sargon, by the alt-right, by Republicans, by Democrats, by any group that is basically upholding implicit white identity politics, but denying whites the right to appeal to white racial interests as an ultimate trump card, then they're going to lose. Every hand you play, you're going to find that the other groups at the table are going to be more likely to win, and you're going to be more likely to lose. And the longer you play that game, the more you lose. And your huge stack of chips is going to dwindle and dwindle and dwindle until you've got nothing, till you've got no wealth, no power, no country of your own, and no future. Well, you have a future, but it's a future at the sufferance of other people who now hold the wealth and power in the society. And that's not a good situation to be in. That's the situation of white South Africans and white Rhodesians today. You don't want to be in that situation. And the only way to prevent ending up in that situation is to stop playing by rigged rules. Stop playing by this pious universalist claptrap that says that white identity politics, objectively white identity politics, is really universal. Look over here, we have Kanye West. Look over there, we've got this based Sikh. All these people are on our side, and they'll find these outliers from other groups, and they'll trot them out and say, see, our overwhelmingly white movement actually is inclusive because it's universally true. It's not that way. And we have to recognize that every form of political ideology ultimately bears some kind of ethnic stamp. And as soon as whites wake up to this fact, we start playing white identity politics. And we didn't have to wake up to this fact when we lived in overwhelmingly white societies. And basically what's going on with people like Sargon and the alt-right and people like that is the libertarians is they just haven't wrapped their minds around the fact that what seems to them to be a universal political ideology really is a parochial white political ideology. And now that we live in multicultural societies, we have to own up to that fact. And as soon as we own up to that fact, then suddenly conservatism, libertarianism, liberalism, whatever, classical liberalism, greenism, whatever, all of these things become forms of white identity politics. And once white people start playing by those rules, then we're going to stop losing. And then we're going to start winning because we have the numbers, we've got the brains, we've got the chips. As soon as we start putting our minds to the problem of creating or recreating societies that are comfortable for us again, we're not going to lose. And the main reason why I feel like Sargon and the alt-right and the conservatives and the libertarians are really, on some deep level, they're really on our side. In their hearts, they know we're right, but their minds are definitely not on our side. And they are absolutely adamantly upholding the one taboo that is destroying the white race, and that is the taboo against explicit white identity politics. If we don't break that taboo down, we're not going to win. And this is why I roll my eyes and get very, very impatient with people who say about candidates who want to go out and run for office, like Patrick Little or Paul Nealon or whatever, on explicit white identity politics platforms. It's not very smart. If you could just be sort of a Trumpian civic nationalist and not talk about this or that, you might actually get into office. And that's actually true. That's actually true. But the greater victory and the more important victory ultimately is dethroning the inhibitions and taboos that surround the topic of white identity politics. And so in terms of the longer game, it is better for people to fight against those taboos than to simply, pay lip service to them to try and in the short run gain political power. Because believe me, that's what every conservative is doing. And it's a losing proposition. It's a losing game. They're going to lose everything, and we're going to lose everything if we bet on them as our champions.
Absolutely. And to continue your poker analogy, I would say when we were the only players at the table, we could afford not having that extra card. Now that there are other players around the table, it is necessary for the game to be fair to have that card. I think you underlie a very important aspect of why identity politics for whites is necessary and inevitable. But I would even make a more general statement that merely the fact that a group of people have racial similarities and therefore they have behavioral similarities and they have preference similarities in the domain of politics and in the domain of how we organize our society, that this mere fact in and of itself justifies an identity politics-based movement in the sense that these people are going to be more similar in what they need from society, and being more similar, they might as well say it and they might as well make it explicit that yes, the reason we want liberty and all this is partly because of our genes, partly because of who we are, and in fact, white people have been shown around the world to deploy societies that are vastly different from what you see in Africa. And it's better if you're going to lead a political project, you might as well know it, because if you don't know it, you will fall for the trap of individualism.